The morning frost crunched under Tom's boots as he walked toward the old red barn. 3 years of running the ranch alone had taught him to appreciate these quiet moments before the sun fully rose. His breath came out in small white clouds, and somewhere in the distance, his cattle were already stirring, ready for their morning feed. Tom had always been an early riser, but these days he woke up even earlier than necessary. Sleep didn't come easy anymore, not since he lost his wife. The house felt too big, too quiet, and sometimes the silence was so heavy it pressed down on his chest like a weight. At least out here with the animals, the quiet felt natural. He was checking the fence line near the back pasture when something moved in his peripheral vision. At first, he thought it might be a deer or maybe one of his cattle had wandered off. But as he turned his head, he realized it was a person. A young woman was huddled against the side of his barn, trying to make herself as small as possible. She looked to be in her early 20s, though it was hard to tell from this distance. Her dark hair was matted and dirty, and she was wearing clothes that seemed way too big for her thin frame. Tom stopped walking and stood very still. In all his years living on this remote piece of Montana land, he could count on one hand the number of unexpected visitors he'd had. The nearest town was 40 miles away, and most people who ended up on his property were either lost or up to no good. The woman hadn't noticed him yet. She was shivering, even though she had wrapped her arms around herself tight. Tom could see her shoulders shaking from where he stood, about 50 feet away. Something about the way she was positioned, pressed against the barn wall like she was, trying to disappear into it, made his chest tighten with concern. He took a step forward, and a twig snapped under his boot. The sound echoed in the crisp morning air, and the woman's head shot up like a frightened animal. Her eyes were wide and filled with pure terror. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the distance. Tom had seen fear before. He'd seen it in the eyes of injured animals, in the face of his wife during her final days in the hospital, but this was different. This was the kind of fear that came from something much worse than physical pain or even death. This was the fear of someone who had been hunted. He raised his hands slowly, palms facing out, the same way he would approach a spooked horse. "Hey there," he called out, keeping his voice soft and low. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." The woman pressed herself even further against the barn wall, if that was possible. Her breathing was coming fast and shallow, and Tom could see her whole body trembling. She looked like she might bolt at any second, though he couldn't imagine where she would run to. There was nothing but open fields and forest for miles in every direction. "Please," she whispered, and her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear. Please don't send me back." Those words hit Tom like a punch to the gut. Send her back where? What had happened to this young woman that had her so terrified? So desperate that she'd rather take her chances in the middle of nowhere than go back to wherever she'd come from? He took another careful step forward, moving the same way he would approach a wild animal that might run or attack out of fear. "I'm not going to send you anywhere," he said, keeping his voice steady and calm. "My name is Tom. This is my ranch. Are you hurt?" She shook her head quickly, but Tom could see that wasn't entirely true. Even from this distance, he could make out what looked like bruises on her arms, and the way she was holding herself suggested she was in pain. "Are you hungry?" he asked. This time she nodded, just barely, like she was afraid to admit it. Tom's mind was racing. This woman was clearly in some kind of serious trouble, and she'd somehow ended up on his property in the middle of winter, miles from the nearest road. She looked like she hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks, and she was dressed for much warmer weather than the February morning they were having. "Okay," he said, taking another small step closer. "How about we get you inside where it's warm, and I'll make you something to eat? Then we can figure out what's going on." "I can work," she said suddenly, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I can clean your house, cook your food, take care of your animals. I don't need much." "Just a place too?" "Stay where they can't find me." The desperation in her voice made Tom's heart ache. Who was they? And what had they done to her that made her so willing to work for a complete stranger just for the promise of safety? He was close enough now to see her more clearly, and what he saw made his blood turn cold. Around her neck was what he had initially thought was some kind of jewelry, maybe a decorative choker. But now he could see it was actually made of metal, dull, and industrial-looking, with what appeared to be a small padlock holding it closed. It wasn't jewelry at all. It was a collar. Tom had to work hard to keep his expression neutral, to not let the horror he was feeling show on his face. He didn't want to scare her any more than she already was, but inside his mind was reeling. What kind of monster puts a collar on a human being like she was some kind of animal? "What's your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated for a long moment, like she was trying to decide whether it was safe to tell him. "Lisa," she finally whispered. "Okay, Lisa, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk very slowly back to my house, and you can follow me if you want to. If you don't want to, that's okay too. But I'm going to leave my front door open, and there's going to be hot coffee and breakfast waiting if you decide you want them." Lisa stared at him with those wide, frightened eyes. She looked like she wanted to trust him, but didn't know how anymore. Tom turned around and started walking toward his house, moving deliberately slowly. He didn't look back, though every instinct told him to check and see if she was following. He knew that if he turned around, she might see it as a threat and run. The walk back to his house had never felt so long. Each step seemed to take forever, and Tom found himself holding his breath, listening for any sound that might tell him whether Lisa was behind him or if she'd disappeared back into the wilderness. When he reached his front porch, he finally turned around. Lisa was there, about 20 feet behind him, following at a distance like a stray dog that wanted food, but didn't trust humans enough to come close. Tom opened his front door and left it wide open. Then he went to his kitchen and started making coffee, the familiar routine helping to calm his nerves. While he tried to process what was happening, he'd found plenty of strays over the years, cats and dogs that had been abandoned or lost, but he'd never found a human being who looked like they'd been treated worse than any animal he'd ever rescued, and he had no idea what he was supposed to do about it. Tom stood at his kitchen counter, measuring coffee grounds with shaking hands. He could hear the old floorboards of his front porch creaking, which meant Lisa was still out there, probably trying to decide whether to come inside or run back into the wilderness. He'd been living alone for 3 years now, and his house had gotten used to silence. But this was a different kind of quiet. This was the tense silence of someone trying to decide between trust and survival. Tom had felt that same uncertainty himself back when the doctors first told him about his wife's diagnosis. Sometimes the unknown felt safer than the truth. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with its familiar sound. Tom opened his refrigerator and started pulling out eggs, bacon, and bread. He made more noise than necessary, hoping the sounds of a normal morning routine might help Lisa feel less afraid. After about 10 minutes, he heard the softest footstep on his kitchen floor. He didn't turn around right away. Instead, he kept his attention on the bacon sizzling in the pan and said, "Coffee's ready if you want some. Mugs are in the cabinet right above the pot." When he finally glanced over his shoulder, Lisa was standing just inside his kitchen doorway, pressed against the wall like she was ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. She was looking around the room with quick, nervous glances, taking in every detail like she was memorizing escape routes. Now that she was inside and he could see her clearly, Tom's heart sank even further. She was much thinner than he'd realized, and those clothes that had looked too big outside were actually hanging off her like empty sacks. The bruises on her arms were darker and more extensive than he'd thought, and there were similar marks around her wrists, but it was still that metal collar around her neck that made his stomach turn. In the light of his kitchen, he could see it was made of some kind of steel, with a small digital display that was either broken or turned off. It looked like something that belonged on a dangerous animal, not a human being. "The bathroom is down the hall if you want to wash up," Tom said, keeping his voice casual. "There are clean towels in the closet." Lisa's eyes darted toward the hallway, then back to him. "You're not going to lock me in?" The question hit Tom like a slap. What kind of life had this young woman been living that she expected to be locked up? "No," he said firmly. "You can leave any time you want. The front door doesn't even have a lock on it." That seemed to surprise her. She stared at him for a long moment, like she was trying to figure out if he was lying. Then she nodded once and disappeared down the hallway. Tom heard the bathroom door close, then the sound of running water. He finished cooking breakfast and set 2 plates on his small kitchen table. He wasn't sure if Lisa would be comfortable sitting down to eat with him, but he wanted to have the option available when she came back. Her face was clean and her hair was damp from where she'd tried to wash it in the sink. She looked younger. Somehow, maybe 19 or 20, though her eyes held the kind of weariness that usually came with much more life experience. "Feel better?" Tom asked. She nodded but remained standing by the kitchen doorway. Her eyes kept moving between him and the food on the table, and Tom could practically see the internal battle she was fighting between hunger and caution. "I made enough for both of us," he said, settling into one of the chairs. "But if you're more comfortable eating standing up, that's fine too." Lisa approached the table like she was walking through a minefield. She pulled out the chair slowly, keeping her eyes on Tom the whole time, then sat down on just the edge of the seat, ready to jump up and run if necessary. The first bite she took was tiny, cautious, but after that she began eating with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had a real meal in a very long time. Tom pretended to focus on his own breakfast, but he was watching her carefully, noting how she held her fork, how she kept glancing at the exits, how she flinched every time a floorboard creaked somewhere in the house. "How long since you've eaten?" he asked gently. 2 days, she whispered. "Maybe 3. It's hard to keep track." Tom's jaw tightened. "Where did you come from, Lisa? How did you end up on my property?" Her whole body went rigid, and for a moment he thought she might bolt from the table. But instead, she set down her fork and stared at her plate. "I walked," she said finally. "I've been walking for days, trying to stay off the main roads. I saw your barn and thought maybe I could hide there for a while, just until I figured out what to do next. Walking from where?" Lisa's hand went instinctively to the collar around her neck, and Tom saw her fingers shake as they touched the metal. "There was a house," she said, her voice barely audible. "About 40 miles east of here, I think. They kept us there." U.S., the word hung in the air like smoke. Tom felt sick thinking about what that might mean. "Who kept you there?" "Bad people," Lisa said, and that was clearly all she was willing to say about it. "They had this tracking thing on me." She touched the collar again. "But I think it broke when I was running through the woods. At least, I hope it did." Tom's mind was racing. He'd heard stories on the news about human trafficking, but it had always seemed like something that happened in big cities, not in rural Montana. The idea that there was a house full of victims just 40 miles from his ranch made his blood boil. "We should call the police," he said. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Lisa shot up from her chair so fast it toppled over backward, hitting the floor with a loud crash. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was shaking her head frantically. "No, please, no police. They'll send me back. They always send us back." Tom raised his hands in a calming gesture, the same way he had outside by the barn. Okay, no police." "I'm sorry I mentioned it." But Lisa was already backing toward the kitchen doorway, her breathing fast and shallow. "I should go. I shouldn't have come here. I'm putting you in danger just by being here. Lisa, wait." Tom stood up slowly, being careful not to make any sudden movements. "You're not putting me in danger, and you don't have to go anywhere you don't want to go." "You don't understand," she said, tears starting to stream down her face. "They'll come looking for me. They always do. And when they find me, they'll hurt anyone who helped me." Tom felt something cold settle in his chest. The idea of these monsters coming to his ranch, threatening this frightening young woman, made him angrier than he'd been in years. "Then we'll figure out how to keep you safe," he said. "But you don't have to face this alone." Lisa stared at him with those wide, frightened eyes. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." It was a fair question, and Tom wasn't entirely sure he knew the answer himself. Maybe it was because he'd spent the last 3 years feeling helpless, watching his wife fade away despite everything. "The doctors tried?" Maybe it was because he recognized the look of someone who'd lost all hope, and he remembered what that felt like, because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. And because everyone deserves to feel safe. Lisa stood there for a long moment, trembling and torn between the instinct to run and the desperate need to trust someone. Finally, she took a small step back toward the kitchen table. "Can I stay?" she whispered. "Just for a little while?" "As long as you need," Tom said. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." 2 weeks had passed since Lisa first appeared at Tom's ranch, and slowly, carefully, she was starting to heal. The guest bedroom that had sat empty for 3 years now had signs of life in it. Clean clothes folded on the dresser, a book from Tom's shelf sitting on the knitstand, and most importantly, the door stayed open during the day. Tom had learned to read Lisa's moods through small signs. When she was having a good day, she would hum quietly while washing dishes. When the nightmares had been bad, she would sit by the kitchen window and stare out at the fields for hours, barely speaking. Today felt like it might be a good day. She was standing at the kitchen sink, washing the breakfast dishes, and Tom could hear her humming something soft under her breath. The sound made his chest feel warm in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The house felt alive again, like it had when his wife was still here. "I was thinking," Tom said, leaning against the kitchen counter, "maybe you'd like to help me feed the chickens today. They're pretty friendly, and one of the hens just hatched some chicks." Lisa turned from the sink, her eyes lighting up with genuine interest. Over the past 2 weeks, Tom had noticed that animals seemed to calm her in a way that people couldn't. She'd spent hours sitting by the fence, watching his cattle graze, and yesterday he'd caught her talking quietly to his old barn cat. "Really? You wouldn't mind?" "I'd like the company," Tom said, and he meant it. "Besides, you've been cooped up in the house too much. Some fresh air might do you good." The chicken coop was behind the house, a sturdy wooden structure Tom had built himself when he and his wife first moved to the ranch. As they walked across the yard, Lisa stayed close to his side, but not in the fearful way she had those first few days. This was different. This was the closeness of someone who was starting to feel safe. Tom opened the gate to the chicken run, and immediately several hens came rushing over, clucking and flapping their wings in excitement. Lisa laughed, actually laughed, at the sight of them competing for attention. "They act like they haven't been fed in weeks," she said, kneeling down to get closer to the birds. "They're just spoiled," Tom replied, scooping chicken feed from the bag he'd brought with him. "Here, hold out your hand like this." He showed her how to let the chickens eat from her palm, and Lisa's face broke into a smile that transformed her completely. For the first time since he'd found her, she looked like the young woman she was supposed to be, instead of someone who'd been through hell. "Oh my goodness, their beaks are so soft," she said, giggling as a particularly bold hen pecked gently at her fingers. "I thought they would hurt. Nah, they're gentle." "Well, most of them are. That big red one over there, Henrietta, she can be a bit bossy." As if she'd heard her name, Henrietta strutted over and fixed them both with a stern look that made Lisa laugh again. The sound was like music to Tom's ears. When was the last time he'd heard genuine laughter in this place? They spent the next hour working together, refilling water containers, collecting eggs, and cleaning out the nesting boxes. Lisa worked with a quiet intensity, like she was grateful to have something useful to do with her hands. Tom found himself watching her more than he should have, noting how her shoulders had started to relax, how she didn't jump at every sudden sound anymore. "Tom," she said suddenly, as they were finishing up. Her voice had gone serious again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, your wife." Lisa gestured toward the house, where a few framed photos were visible through the kitchen window. "What was she like?" Tom felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always came when someone mentioned Carol, but it wasn't as sharp as it used. She was kind," he said simply. "The kind of person who would bring home every stray animal she found, even when we already had too many. She would have liked you." Lisa was quiet for a moment, processing this. "How long has she been gone?" 3 years this October. Tom closed the chicken coop gate and latched it securely. "Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, but in the end, I'm sorry, Lisa said softly. That must have been really hard. Still is some days. Tom picked up the empty feed bag and slung it over his shoulder. But having you here, it's helped. The house doesn't feel so empty anymore. They walked back toward the house in comfortable silence. Lisa seemed to be thinking about something, and Tom had learned not to push when she got that distant look in her eyes. She would talk when she was ready, that evening. After they'd had dinner and Tom was reading in his favorite chair, Lisa appeared in the living room doorway. She'd been unusually quiet since their conversation by the chicken coop, and Tom could tell something was weighing on her mind. Tom? Her voice was small, uncertain. Yeah? I need to tell you something. About where I came from, about what happened to me. Tom set down his book and gave her his full attention. In the 2 weeks she'd been here, Lisa had shared very little about her past. He knew she'd been held against her will, and he knew she was terrified of being found. But the details remained a mystery. Lisa sat down on the edge of the couch, perched. There like she might need to run at any moment. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and Tom could see her knuckles were white with tension. I wasn't always like this, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 years ago I was in college. I was studying to be a teacher. I wanted to work with little kids. Tom's heart ached at the past tense she was using, like that version of herself was dead and gone. I was walking to my car after class one night, and this woman approached me. She said she worked for a modeling agency, that she'd been watching me and thought I had potential. She gave me her card and said I could make good money doing photo shoots. Lisa's voice was getting smaller and smaller, and Tom had to strain to hear her. I should have known it was too good to be true. But I needed money for school, and she seemed so professional, so legitimate. She picked me up the next day and said we were going to a studio for test shots. Tom felt sick. He could see where this story was going, and he wanted to tell her she didn't have to continue, but he also knew she needed to get it out. There was no studio. There was just a house and men with guns and this. Lisa's hand went to the collar around her neck. They put this on me the first day. It has a GPS tracker in it, and if you try to remove it without the right key, it gives you an electric shock. Tom's hands clenched into fists. He'd suspected something like this, but hearing it said out loud made it real in a way that filled him with rage. They kept me there for 2 years. Me and 6 other girls. They moved us around sometimes, different houses, different cities, but always with these collars, always watched. Lisa was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but she kept talking like a dam had burst inside her. They told us no one was looking for us, that our families had forgotten about us, that if we ever tried to escape, they would find us and make us wish we'd never been born. Lisa, Tom said gently, but she held up a hand to stop him. I need to finish this. I need you to understand what you've gotten yourself into by helping me. She took a shaky breath and continued. 3 weeks ago, they were moving us to a new location. The van broke down on a back road, and the men got out to look at the engine. I was sitting by the door, and I realized they hadn't locked it properly. So I ran. Lisa looked up at Tom with eyes full of pain and fear and something else he couldn't quite identify. I've been running ever since. Sleeping in the woods, eating whatever I could find, always looking over my shoulder. And then I found your barn, and you were so kind to me, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt like maybe I could be safe. Tom stood up and moved to sit beside her on the couch, being careful to leave enough space so she wouldn't feel trapped. You are safe here, he said firmly. I promise you that. Lisa turned to look at him, and in her eyes, Tom saw something that took his breath away. It was trust, pure and simple. After everything she'd been through, after all the reasons she had to never trust another human being, she was choosing to trust him. Tom, she said, her voice trembling, I know this might sound strange, and you can say no if it makes you uncomfortable, but can I hug you just once? The question caught him completely off guard. In all the time she'd been here, Lisa had carefully avoided any physical contact. She would step aside if he got too close, flinch if he reached past her for something. idea that she was asking for a hug, that she wanted that kind of human connection, made his throat tight with emotion. "I haven't had a kind touch in so long," she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "And you've been so good to me, so patient and gentle. I just want to remember what it feels like to be hugged by someone who doesn't want to hurt me." Tom felt tears prick at his own eyes. This brave, broken young woman was asking him for something so simple, so basic, and yet he understood it was the most courageous thing she'd done since escaping. "Of course," he said softly. "Of course you can." Lisa moved closer to him on the couch, slowly, carefully. When she leaned into him, Tom wrapped his arms around her gently, the way he might hold something precious and fragile. She was so thin he could feel her ribs, but she was warm and alive and real. For 3 beautiful weeks after that evening hug, Tom watched Lisa slowly come back to life. She smiled more often now, hummed while she worked, and had even started talking about maybe taking online classes someday. The nightmares still came, but less frequently, and she'd begun sleeping with her bedroom door closed, which Tom knew was a big step for her. They developed a comfortable routine. Lisa would help with the morning chores, and Tom taught her about caring for the animals. In the afternoons, she'd read books from his wife's collection while he worked on ranch maintenance. Evenings were spent talking over dinner or watching old movies on his small television. It was the closest thing to happiness Tom had felt since losing his wife, and he could see Lisa changing too. Her cheeks had filled out from regular meals. The constant tension in her shoulders was easing, and sometimes she would laugh at something on TV with genuine joy instead of the careful, practiced responses she'd shown in those first weeks. But on a Thursday morning in early March, everything changed. Tom was in the barn, repairing a broken stall door when Lisa came running in. Her face was pale, and she was breathing hard like she'd been running. "Tom," she said, her voice tight with fear, "there's a car parked at the end of your driveway." Tom set down his hammer and looked at her carefully. "What kind of car?" "Black sedan. The windows are too dark to see inside, but it's been sitting there for 10 minutes. It wasn't there when I fed the chickens this morning." A cold feeling settled in Tom's stomach. In all his years living on this remote ranch, he'd never had anyone just park at the end of his driveway and sit there. People who had legitimate business. "Came up to the house?" "Stay here," he told Lisa, but she grabbed his arm. "No, don't go out there. Please, what if it's them?" Tom could see the old fear creeping back into her eyes, the same terror that had been there that first morning by the barn. All the progress she'd made over the past month seemed to be crumbling in real time. "It might just be someone who's lost," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Or maybe someone having car trouble." But even as he said it, Tom didn't believe it. Something about this felt wrong, felt dangerous. And if Lisa's instincts were telling her to be afraid, he was going to listen to them. "We'll both stay inside," he decided, "and we'll watch from the window." They went to the living room, where Tom's front window gave them a clear view down the long gravel driveway to the main road. Sure enough, there was a black car parked right at the entrance to his property. It had been positioned so that anyone coming or going would have to pass right by it. Tom and Lisa watched for another 20 minutes, but the car didn't move. No. One got out. It just sat there like a predator waiting for prey. "This isn't good," Lisa whispered. "They used to do this sometimes when they were trying to find girls who had run away. They'd park near places where they thought we might be hiding. And just wait." Tom's jaw tightened. "Well, they can wait all they want. This is private property, and they have no right to be here." But even as he said it, Tom was running through options in his mind. His ranch was isolated, which had always been a blessing. Before now it felt like a trap. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the sheriff's office was 40 miles in the other direction. The car finally left around noon, but the damage was done. Lisa was jumpy and scared, flinching at every sound. She kept checking the locks on the doors and windows, even though Tom had told her the front door didn't even have a lock. "We should get locks," she said, pacing back and forth in the kitchen, "and maybe some kind of security system. Cameras or an alarm or something." Tom had never needed any of those things before, but looking at Lisa's frightened face, He realized their peaceful bubble had been burst. The outside world had found them. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He kept getting up to look out the windows, checking for headlights or movement in the darkness. Around 3 in the morning, he heard Lisa's bedroom door open and soft footsteps. In the hallway, he found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea, staring out the window into the black night. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked Dot. She shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that car. I keep thinking about what they'll do to me if they find me. What they'll do to you for helping me." Tom sat down across from her. "Lisa, look at me." She turned her eyes away from the window and met his gaze. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Do you understand me? Whatever it takes, whoever these people are, I will not let them take you. But what if they come back? What if they bring more people? You can't fight them all, Tom. These aren't just criminals, they're organized. They have resources, connections. They've been doing this for years." Tom reached across the table and took her hands in his. They were ice cold and shaking. "Then we'll get help. There have to be people who specialize in this kind of thing. Organizations that help trafficking victims." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "I've been thinking the same thing. But Tom, if we contact anyone official, they'll want me to testify. They'll want me to tell them everything, relive all of it. And what if the people who took me have connections with law enforcement? What if calling for help just leads them right to us?" It was a terrifying thought, but Tom could see the logic in her fear. If these criminals had been operating for years without getting caught, they probably had ways of staying ahead of the authorities. "My wife," Tom said suddenly. "Before she got sick, she used to volunteer with a women's shelter in the city. They help women in dangerous situations, women running from abusive husbands and boyfriends. Maybe they would know who we could trust." Lisa considered this. "Do you still have their contact information?" "I think so." Carol kept a whole address book of organizations she supported. It's probably still in her desk. They spent the next hour going through Carol's old papers, looking for anything that might help. Finally, Tom found what he was looking for, a business card for something called the Mountain State Victim Services Center. "They have a 24-hour hotline," Tom said, reading the back of the card. "It says they help victims of human trafficking." Lisa stared at the card like it might bite her. What if it's a trap? What if these people aren't who they say they are? "What if they are?" Tom countered gently. "Lisa, we can't live like this. Looking over our shoulders, jumping at every car that drives by? That's not living, that's just surviving." They talked until dawn, weighing their options. By the time the sun came up, they'd made a decision. They would call the hotline, but they would be careful about what information they shared until they were sure they could trust whoever they were talking to. The black car came back the next day, and the day after that. Always parking in the same spot, always staying for several hours before leaving. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. Lisa was becoming more anxious and fearful with each passing day. On the third day, Tom noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were tire tracks in the soft dirt near his back pasture, tracks that definitely hadn't been there before. Someone had been driving around his property in the dark, probably looking for the best ways to approach the house without being seen. That evening, as they were finishing dinner, Lisa suddenly gasped and pointed toward the kitchen window. "Tom, look, there, taped to the outside of the window, was a piece of paper." Tom's heart started pounding as he approached to read it. In block letters. Someone had written, "We know you're here. Bring her to the old bridge on Route 47 at midnight tomorrow. Or we'll come get her ourselves." Lisa read the note over his shoulder and started shaking. "They found me," she whispered. "They actually found me." Tom pulled her away from the window and closed the curtains. His mind was racing. These people had been on his property, close enough to his house to tape a note to his window. They could have easily broken in if they'd wanted to. "We're calling that hotline tonight," he said firmly. "This has gone far enough." "But what if they're watching the house? What if they hear?" "Just make the call?" Tom looked around his kitchen. The same kitchen where he'd made breakfast for Lisa that first morning, where they'd shared so many peaceful meals over the past month. It didn't feel safe anymore. Nothing felt safe. Then we'll have to take that risk, he said. Because the alternative is letting these monsters take you back, and that's not happening. Not while I'm breathing. Lisa looked at him with tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry I brought this to your door, Tom. You were finally finding peace after losing your wife, and I ruined it. Tom pulled her into another one of those careful, gentle hugs that had become their way of comforting each other. You didn't ruin anything, he said into her hair. You gave me a reason to care about something again. You gave me a purpose. And now we're going to fight for it. As they stood there holding each other in the kitchen, both of them knew that their quiet, healing days were over. The battle for Lisa's freedom was about to begin, and neither of them knew if they were strong enough to win it, but they were going to try, together. The phone call to the Mountain State Victim Services Center changed everything. The woman who answered spoke with a calm, professional voice that somehow made Lisa feel safer just hearing it. Her name was Detective Rodriguez, and she specialized in human trafficking cases. I need you to listen carefully, Detective Rodriguez said after Tom and Lisa had explained their situation. First, you did the right thing by calling us. Second, you're not alone in this anymore. We've been tracking this particular group for 8 months, and Lisa's information could be the key to stopping them. Lisa's hand was shaking as she held the phone. But what about the meeting tomorrow night? They want me to come to the old bridge on Route 47. You're not going anywhere near that bridge, the detective said firmly. But we are. This is exactly the kind of opportunity we've been waiting for. Over the next several hours, Detective Rodriguez and her team arrived at Tom's ranch. They came in unmarked vehicles, approaching from different directions to avoid being spotted by anyone who might be watching. Lisa was amazed by how quickly and quietly they worked. The lead detective was a kind woman about Tom's age, with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail. She sat with Lisa at the kitchen table and listened patiently as Lisa told her story again, this time with all the details she'd been too scared to share before. You're incredibly brave, Detective Rodriguez said when Lisa finished. The information. You've given us matches what we suspected about their operation. They've been moving victims between several locations across 3 states. What happens to the other girls? Lisa asked, her voice small. The ones who were with me? That's what we're going to find out. But I need to be honest with you, Lisa. To build a case strong enough to put these people away for life, we're going to need your testimony. Are you prepared for that? Lisa looked at Tom, who nodded encouragingly. What if they come after me again? They won't get the chance, Detective Rodriguez promised. After tomorrow night, they're going to be too busy dealing with federal charges to worry about anything else. The plan was complex but carefully thought out. The traffickers expected Lisa to show up at the bridge at midnight, but instead they would find undercover agents waiting for them. Meanwhile, other teams would simultaneously raid the locations where victims were being held. Based on information Lisa had provided about the houses she remembered, Tom insisted on being part of the operation, even though the detectives tried to convince him to stay away. She's been through enough, he said, gesturing toward Lisa. I'm not abandoning her now. Detective Rodriguez studied Tom's face for a moment, then nodded. You can observe from a safe distance, but you follow our lead completely. This isn't a movie, Mr. Morrison. These people are dangerous. The night of the operation, Tom and Lisa sat in an unmarked van about half a mile from the old bridge, watching everything unfold through night vision equipment. Lisa was wearing a bulletproof vest under her jacket, even though she was nowhere. Near the actual danger zone, at exactly midnight, 2 black cars pulled up to the bridge. Tom counted 4 men getting out, and his stomach turned when he saw they were all carrying weapons. These were the monsters who had held Lisa captive for 2 years, who had put that collar around her neck and treated her like property. The federal agents moved with military precision. Within minutes, all 4 men were on the ground in handcuffs, and Detective Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. Package secured. All units proceed to secondary locations. Lisa was crying, but they were tears of relief. Is it really over? She whispered. The arrests are just the beginning, Detective Rodriguez explained later, back at the ranch. But yes, the immediate danger to you is over. These men will never hurt you or anyone else again. Over the following weeks, the scope of the trafficking ring became clear. 17 victims were rescued from various locations, including the 6 girls who had been held with Lisa. The organization had been operating for over 5 years, moving victims across state lines and using them for forced labor and exploitation. Lisa's testimony was crucial in building the case, and though it was difficult for her to relive those experiences in court, she found strength in knowing that her words were helping to free other victims and prevent future crimes. The trial lasted 3 months. Tom was there every day, sitting in the gallery to support Lisa as she faced her captors in court. Watching her on the witness stand, speaking clearly and bravely about what had happened to her, Tom felt an overwhelming sense of pride. This was not the same terrified young woman he'd found by his barn. This was someone who had reclaimed her power. When the verdicts came in, guilty on all counts for all defendants, Lisa collapsed into Tom's arms in the courthouse hallway, sobbing with relief. It's really over, she kept saying. They can never hurt anyone else. The metal collar that had been around her neck for 2 years was finally removed by FBI technicians as evidence. Lisa rubbed the spot where it had been, feeling her neck for the first time in so long. The physical scars would fade, but Tom knew the emotional healing would take much longer. As the months passed, Lisa began to rebuild her life with a determination that amazed everyone around her. She enrolled in online college courses, picking up where she'd left off 2 years earlier. Her dream of becoming a teacher hadn't died, though now she was particularly interested in working with children who had experienced trauma. Tom's ranch became an unofficial sanctuary. Detective Rodriguez connected them with a non-profit organization that helped trafficking survivors, and soon they were hosting other young women who needed a safe place to heal. Lisa became a mentor to these survivors, using her own experience to help them navigate the difficult path back to normal life. The guest bedroom became a rotation of temporary homes for women in crisis. The kitchen table, where Tom and Lisa had shared so many quiet meals, now hosted support group meetings and planning sessions for survivor advocacy programs. One evening, about a year after the arrests, Tom and Lisa were sitting on the front porch, watching the sunset. The ranch was busier now, with 3 other survivors currently staying with them, but tonight it was just the 2 of them enjoying a quiet moment. Do you ever regret it? Lisa asked, taking me in that first morning. Your life was so peaceful before I showed up. Tom considered the question seriously. His life had been peaceful, but it had also been empty. Now it was full of purpose and meaning in a way it hadn't been since his wife died. I regret that you had to go through what you did, he said finally. But I don't regret a single moment since you asked me for that hug. You gave me my life back, Lisa. You helped me remember that healing happens when we help each other. Lisa smiled, and it was the same genuine, joyful smile she'd shown that first day when the chickens had made her laugh. But now it was stronger, more confident. This was the smile of someone who had survived the worst thing imaginable and chosen to use that experience to help others. I have some news, she said, pulling an envelope from her pocket. I got accepted to the social work program at the State University. They have a specialization in trauma counseling. Tom's face broke into a huge grin. Lisa, that's incredible. When do you start? Fall semester, but I was hoping. She paused, suddenly looking nervous. I was hoping I could keep living here while I study. I know you've got other people who need the space, but this place, this ranch, it's become home. To me, and the work we're doing here, helping other survivors, I want to keep being part of that. Tom reached over and squeezed her hand. This will always be your home, for as long as you want it to be, your family now. As they sat there watching the stars come out over the Montana sky, Tom thought about that first morning when he'd found a frightened young woman by his barn. Neither of them could have imagined then how that moment would change both their lives. Lisa had asked him for one hug, just to remember what kindness felt like. That simple request had grown into something much bigger, a reminder that human connection and compassion could overcome even the darkest circumstances. They had both found healing by choosing to care for each other. For the other survivors who came after, the ranch that had once been a place of quiet grief was now alive, with hope and purpose. And sometimes, late at night when the house was full of women rebuilding their lives, Tom could swear he felt his wife's presence there too, smiling at what her home had become. It had all started with a question about a hug. Now it was a sanctuary, where broken people came to remember they were worth saving.